friends, welcome to the discussion on Wollstonecraft's first two essays in her book Rights of Woman. And she is referring to Rousseau in the first chapter as a kind of a person who otherwise was very influential, but in certain respects he was supposed to be questioned, so that Wollstonecraft would argue the idea that would support reason. So Rousseau, according to her, became enamored of solitude. Loneliness he liked. Why did he like it? This is what we have to consider. And being at the same time an optimist. You see, an optimist cannot love solitude. An optimist is one who relates well with other people, takes interest in their affairs, tells them what is wrong and right, mixes with them in order to fight along with them against falsehood, against, she would say, Wollstonecraft would say, prejudices. And Rousseau was against prejudices, and at the same time he loved or was enamored of solitude. So that's a mistake that Rousseau made, according to her. And being at the same time an optimist, he labors with uncommon eloquence to prove that man was naturally a solitary animal. Is that true? That man is naturally a solitary animal? That men, believe only in sitting in a corner and keeping quiet? You discuss this question in your own mind. I consider it in my own mind, and I think this is absolutely false. Romantics might say this. Romantic poets in the late 18th and early 19th centuries might say that there is so much of noise in the world that we should always remain away from them and remain quiet. And Rousseau was a romantic. But she says that if Rousseau had used reason, then he would have found out that there was a good worth in human beings, and it was a point to fight prejudices, and they were not doing that, and they were in fact escapists. So this is the fault that she finds with Rousseau in the 19th century, in the 18th century, and this is there in the essay itself. Misled by, she says, misled by his respect for the goodness of God. In those days, it was God was a part of the terminology, and you could interpret God in your own way, and with God you could understand the problems of men and women. Goodness of God, who certainly, for what man of sense and feeling can doubt it, nobody can doubt this, gave life only to communicate happiness. So this is what, according to this is what the Rousseau misunderstood, that God only wanted to communicate happiness. Yes, happiness God wants to communicate, but that happiness also means that you are in touch with people around you rather than being lonely. Rousseau considers evil as positive and the work of man, not aware that he was exalting one attribute at the expense of another, equally necessary to divine perfection. So she says that we should keep God out of it and try to consider the idea of Rousseau himself. So Rousseau was always talking about the human being who had the usefulness of evil in it, and in fact there is nothing but evil, because human beings were considered at that time to be projections of evil, and that evil had to be understood, and Rousseau would not take any position on evil. So this is what the romantic notion also was in the 18th century, and this person says that Rousseau was wrong. Why should he talk only about happiness and should therefore remain alone? And why should he not take a position on evil, which is maybe natural, but then that thing is to be also accepted or understood with the help of reason. So just see how well she is able to capture the faults of Rousseau, that evil is to be considered, evil is to be explained, evil is to be reasoned out. And then you can't say evil is natural in human beings. This seems to be a quotation from Rousseau himself. So she finds the fault with Rousseau and says that reason should be used in order to understand some of the things that we do not like, instead of saying that human beings make mistakes and making mistakes is human. It's not. Actually, what is human? thinking is human, reasoning out is human, understanding is human, getting knowledge is human. And Rousseau would not argue in favor of knowledge, he would always argue in favor of existence. With the concept of monarchy and the figure of the monarch in mind, Wollstonecraft has to make the following important point. Surely, she says, it is madness to make the fate of thousands depend on caprice of a weak fellow creature whose very station sinks him necessarily below the meanest of his subjects. What is she saying? Saying something very shocking. Who is the meanest of the means? Meanest of the mean in the world? Generally, we think that king is very powerful, king is very great, king is glorious, and all those things. But it says actually the king is very mean. The king is a weak fellow because he is not using reason; he is using his power. And if somebody is using his power, then this person is weak. And it's madness to make the fate of thousands depend on caprice of a weak fellow creature. So how many people support the king? The king is supported by the entire court. The king is supported by, in fact, the population of the country, and is supposed to be very strong. Whose very station sinks him necessarily below the meanest of his subjects. His station is such because he is not doing anything himself. He is using power everywhere, and if you use power, then of course you are a mean fellow. So she comes down very heavily on kings, because kings would mean that there are others who are followers. In society, a king means that there is something superior. There is a superior power with us, and that power is controlling us, and we should be controlled by this power. And when Wollstonecraft says, why should we be controlled? We are all human beings. God made us equal, and if we are equal, then why should we sacrifice our sense of equality at the behest of somebody who is supposed to be powerful? So the powerful person should actually be seen in the true light, and then one would say that the power was artificial. But one power should not be thrown down to exalt another. The actual power is equality, and that power considers that all human beings are equal. And if you say that monarch is more powerful than us and that he can rule us, then of course we are accepting something which is false. For all power inebriates, it makes us drunk, the weak man, and its abuse proves that the more equality there is established among men, the more virtue and happiness will reign in society. Now this is the crux of the first essay, that equality will take care of all those things. So make people equal, not that the king is strong and the rest are subjects. There is nothing like subjects, nothing like janta. All of us are equal human beings, and all of us have equal amount of capacity to develop virtue in us with the help of reason, and therefore we should not have any kind of respect for a powerful person, because his power is not his. He was not born powerful. He attained that power with the help of other people's bravery and all those things, and therefore he befooled others and became powerful. So I come to the end of the first essay. This essay forms a background to the second one, elaborating Wollstonecraft's view about woman. As said earlier, the title is The Prevailing Opinion of Sexual Character Discussed. So now we will be talking about the attitude meted out to women in society of the time. The essay is assertive in nature. Assertive, actually, this kind of a writing should make us very inspired, because Wollstonecraft is very assertive. Her style is declamatory, as if she is making a speech, as if she is using good words, strong words, in order to wake us up. Most of us remain asleep in our minds, and whatever is told us, we simply accept it, and that is wrong, because whatever is told us should be subjected to analysis, should be subjected to understanding, and if we find it right, then we should accept it. And accepting after seeing that it is right will actually render us powerful enough to distribute this kind of wisdom to others. So that is what the essay is pointing out in the second part. The case of woman passionately. The points made in it refer to great writers such as Milton, Pope, Rousseau, and a few contemporary ones such as Dr. Gregory, who treat women as inferior, who treat women in such a manner that they are not equal to men. And this she will make it very clear in the second chapter that we are reading. And see that interestingly, she is quoting people like Milton, people like Alexander Pope, like Rousseau, as I already pointed out, and a contemporary of hers, and this person was like a teacher to her. She knew him and she was guided by him, but she also disagreed with him, Dr. Gregory. So these people, talk about women in such a manner that they appear to be supporting them, but actually they are harming them, and that is what we should be aware about. Let us see in some details of the subjects Wollstonecraft engages with. What are the details? Most of it concerns woman in association with man, the two being for Wollstonecraft equal and freedom-loving. This is a good point. This is the basis of the second essay, that men and women are both equal and they both love freedom. But is that the case? Actually, you would say that men and women are not equal. We always say women should remain beautiful, women should remain inspiring, women should give the example of innocence, they should give the example of femininity, all those things. But no, so far as Wollstonecraft is concerned, they should be equal, they should also reason, they should also think, they should also grow, they should also become adult, they should also have wisdom, and this quality in women is not appreciated. But she says, Wollstonecraft says, that women should also enjoy freedom because they love freedom, and that loving freedom actually will add to the qualities in them. The latter freedom is the goal of woman in society, and this goal is yet to be achieved. So far, we have not given freedom to. Women have not been able to achieve freedom through their own behavior, and the fault is not of women, the fault is of the very organization in which women are compelled to live. And she talks about Milton. Yes, I agree that Milton presents Eve in definitive terms as somebody who is very pleasing. And he says, why aren't men pleasing? Why should women be pleasing more than men and things like that? Because that is not equal. So Milton, in fact, when he presents Eve on in Paradise Lost, then he has those terms which associate pleasure and obedience and some kind of devotion, and as if women are born to remain devoted and remain to give pleasure to others. So later on, of course, Milton is a great writer, and he will understand that this kind of a thing cannot really hold. Therefore, he will change his stance also. But the same Milton, she says, later makes Adam speak the language of equality. Adam, is angry at one point of time, if not angry, at least dissatisfied with the way he lived along with Eve in Garden of Eden, and that there was a question, and he was discussing that question with God, and then Adam spoke in support of Eve, and there he talked the language of equality. So Milton is that way a great writer, and he could see that equality even before God had to be mentioned. The most perfect education, in my opinion, says Wollstonecraft, is such an exercise of the understanding as best calculated is to strengthen the body and form the heart. That is important. Not that you make the body beautiful, you make the body soft, you make the body comely. But body should be strengthened, and harm should also be strong. And if that is not the case, then you will be expecting one thing from men and another thing from women. You will laud, applaud bravery in men and beauty in women, which is, in her opinion, wrong. Riches and hereditary honors have made ciphers of women. They have rendered them, they have reduced them to zeros. To give consequence to the numerical figure, and idleness has produced a mixture of gallantry and despotism into society. There are two things. Men are supposed to be brave, men are supposed to be strong bodily, and they are supposed to remain despots, and women should always remain slaves. This is the prejudice that is there in the minds of all of us, and it's deeply ingrained there. Now see the joke here, which leads the very men who are the slaves of their mistresses. A gallant person is one who falls in love with a woman and he calls her his mistress, and he always bows down before her in some kind of respect. But the same lover, the same gallant person who is showing his obedience to a beautiful woman because she is his beloved, the same person comes back home and then he tyrannizes his sisters, his wives, and these people, gallants, they tyrannize, they threaten and make people tremble before them. They are angry with them, sisters, wives, and daughters. Why? Why is beloved superior and why are sisters, wives, and daughters inferior? She asks, and she can ask because she is talking with the help of, with the strength of reason. That the same person who is writing good poetry about his beloved, and she says, "You are my master and I am your slave," and all those things, comes back home and he tyrannizes, he dictates terms to, and he threatens and punishes his sisters, his wives, their wives, and the daughters. So everybody is a woman, and treat women as women and a woman as a woman, and do not make a distinction between a beloved on one side, there you are a gallant, and a daughter on the other, because you are a father there, and that you have the power of the father in the family. Youth is the season for love in both sexes, that's fine. But love is the season. Love is good in the time of youth. You can't have love all your life. You can't have love at the age of 40, 50, 60 and always remain a lover, because you have to also organize ways to create peace and stability and thinking in others, and you have to talk about equality and tolerance. All those things are there in society, but no, youth is the season for love, right? We should agree. In both sexes, not merely in men, in women only, but in men also. But in those days of thoughtless enjoyment, now this is a question that we should consider seriously, because she says that love is fine, but love also means thoughtless enjoyment, because there is no thought in love. There is only liking. You want to sit with a beloved and talk very sweetly with her, and the beloved will coyly respond to you, and you can spend good time there, 2 hours, 3 hours, but then you have to get back home. You have to think of bread and butter. You have to think of the bread and butter the next day, of a job, and all those things are not in the domain of love. They are in the domain of necessity, in the domain of needs, and they are human beings, both men and women. They should engage with the problems of living, which love alone cannot suffice to serve the purpose. Provision should be made for the more important years of life. Which are the more important years of life? Somebody will say from 20 to 30, because that's the time when you love. Some people would say still more important years of life are 40, 50, 60, because then you are thinking about the society as a whole, about its problems, about the threat to peace and stability. So who will look after that? When reflection takes place of sensation. Love is sensation. Love is the feeling of goodness. But reflection is the question of thinking. So you reflect, you think, you use reason. And if you put one against the other, then you would realize that life cannot be lived peacefully, life cannot be lived intelligently, life cannot be lived with dignity. And dignity, intelligence, peace, stability, they are important. And who will look after all those things if love only is important? So in a way, she is coming hammer and tongs at the romantics who talk only of loneliness, who talk only of remaining with the beloved and enjoying themselves. So, and this works to the disadvantage of women, because you are giving wrong ideas to women by telling them that they are supposed to be beautiful and they are supposed to be always arousing a sense of desire in you, and that if they are servile to you, then you feel happy. So you are in a way telling women to remain servile, to remain sweet and pleasing and all those things. And that is why that is males, they don't allow women to grow up. So what is a wife? A wife, according to her, is an overgrown child. Because you always tell the wife to become innocent and to remain innocent. And she should always, flatter you. She should always encourage you. She should also serve you. She can't disagree with you. A woman is not supposed to disagree, because a disagreeing woman is somebody who is very unpopular. It's not womanly to disagree. It's not womanly to argue with. If she argues with you, then it's not a woman's quality. So this is what, and I think we have to think of this feminist idea. The basic, the kernel of the idea is that a woman is never supposed to grow up. Is never supposed to become an adult in life. She is always an overgrown child. Let the honest heart show itself, and reason teach passion to submit to necessity. This is important. Passion should not be allowed to reign supreme in society. Passion should always submit to, should be disciplined by necessity. There are things that you have to do. Or let the dignified pursuit of virtue and knowledge raise the mind above those emotions which rather embitter than sweeten the cup of life. There will be a time when love will not be enough. At the age of 40 or 50, when the man has already been satiated and the woman has been left in the lurch because she was not allowed to develop other qualities, then marriage will end in, the communication between men and women will end in some kind of bitterness. And why this bitterness? Because the two people did not grow up that way. They always remained prisoners of their prejudices, and women were particularly harmed by this kind of attitude, because they were not exposed to the idea of dignity, the idea of equality, the idea of taking decisions and implementing them. That domain completely remained in the hands of men, and therefore women remained subservient, they remained slaves, and they didn't become equal. And if a slave is obedient, then you like that quality in the slave. But the slave remains a slave. Obedience, in fact, turns a person into a slave. And is obedience good? No. What is good? The good thing is that two people get together, they discuss things dispassionately in equal terms, and either one or the other can be right. So it's not that necessarily the male is supposed to think and he is supposed to be right, and then the woman is supposed to follow and to remain subservient. Therefore, that is the womanly quality. And the important point that Wollstonecraft is making, and I particularly focus upon this. So far as the Wollstonecraft is concerned, she is driven by this idea that I'm going to elaborate now. She says, I love man as my fellow, as my equal, as my friend. The person who can tell me that I'm wrong, and the person who can tell me I'm right. A fellow means an equal person, a class fellow, a fellow in society. So you walk together, you discuss together, you have equal talents. She has mind, you also have mind. So men and women can remain fellows. That is the ideal that she is talking about. And that the sex should not be a differentiating factor. The sex should be a factor that both of us are dependent on each other, and that they can always use reason in order to understand the problems that they face. So the first essay and the second essay, they finally come to stand on the idea of reason, the idea of virtue, and that virtue is possible only when people are equal. I think that this point is incontrovertible. You cannot disagree with this point, that unless you live with a friend, and unless you make a woman a friend, unless you give her the treatment of friendship, unless you give her the idea of equality, unless you give her the responsibility to do the same things that you are doing, and you do it together, she is not a fellow. And if she is not a fellow, the fun disappears from life. So feminism in the initial sense, in the 18th century, when Mary Wollstonecraft came with these revolutionary ideas, and imagine that these ideas are revolutionary because they actually emanate from French Revolution, which was at its core an expression of human dignity and equality. So the monarch was not needed, the king was not needed. Who was needed? The person, the fellow citizen who will discuss, who will use reason in order to understand things, so that the two together would make the world a world of harmony. But his scepter, real or usurped, extends not to me. She said, I will not accept scepter, I will not accept rod, I will not accept any kind of punishment from anybody, unless the reason of an individual demands my homage. Reason is important. So you use reason, I will use reason, she says, and then I pay homage to you and you pay homage to me. And even then the submission is to reason and not to man. This is, I think, it's a mind-boggling statement in the 18th century, and even today it is. That, you are submitting, if at all, not to one another. You are submitting to reason. So reason alone, which is a trait of society, which is a trait of the human beings in society, that trait will tell us all the time whether we are wrong or right. So in these two essays, she is talking about, first, the prejudices in society that are supposed to be rooted out, and the second, that equality is to be made the prime governing factor of human interaction and relationship. So these two essays tell us about the crux of feminism as it began in the 18th century, and I believe that it's not just a good beginning, it goes very far. It covers also the life in the 20th and the 21st centuries, and that if we forget her, then we will be forgetting her only wrongly. So with these words, I come to the conclusion of the two essays written by her in this book, Vindication, and I'm sure that these ideas will give us enough food for thought. Thank you.